Hello, boys and girls. Thanks for joining Granny Lee for another Bible story. Now, if you remember, last week we talked about Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, which we learn about at Christmas time. So you might remember hearing about Mary. And in our story last week, we talked about how an angel came to Mary and told her she was going to have a baby. This week, we're going to talk a little bit about who that baby was and where he was born. So there was a man also in Jesus's life. His name was Joseph, and Joseph was the man that God asked to raise his son. And so Joseph was kind of like Jesus' daddy. And we know that Mary was his mommy. And so when Mary was almost ready to have Jesus, they had to travel to Bethlehem, which was another city away from where they lived. So it's kind of like if you live in Johnson City and maybe you had to go to Knoxville or something. So they had to take a trip. And while they were in Bethlehem, it was time for Jesus to be born. And unfortunately, there were nowhere in the inns for Mary and Joseph to stay. An inn is kind of like a hotel. There was no room in the hotels. And so one of the innkeepers heard that Mary and Joseph had nowhere to stay. So he said to them, "All my rooms are full, but there is somewhere you can spend the night." And he showed them to a stable where animals were kept, which is kind of like a barn. It was dirty and smelly, but it was the best they could do. And that night, Mary's baby was born. She carefully wrapped him in strips of cloth and gently laid him on clean straw in a manger. Mary and Joseph looked at their son with joy and named him Jesus, just like the angel had told them. Here we can see there's Jesus and Mary and Joseph in the barn. Yeah, so that was pretty interesting. And if you remember your Christmas story, eventually shepherds came to see Jesus and wise men came to see Jesus because he was really exciting. And the reason Jesus is so awesome is because he actually is God. He's God that took on a body and came to live with people for like 33 years. And the reason he came was so that we could be friends with God again if we wanted to. Because you remember back with Adam and Eve in the very beginning of time, they didn't listen to God and do what he asked them to do. And so because they disobeyed, they could not be friends with God anymore. But that made God very sad because he wants to be friends with you and I. And he wants us to go to heaven to be with him forever. But the only way we can do that is through Jesus. And so Jesus was God's plan. Remember how we talked about God had a plan so that we could be friends with him again? And Jesus, who is God, came as a man, and this was God's plan. But there's more to the story. Right now, Jesus is just being born. Next week, we'll talk about some of the things he did when he was a grown man, and then we'll end up talking about what he did at the end so that we could be friends with God again if we choose to follow Jesus. So now Jesus is born, and we get to some more really exciting stories about him starting next week. So I love you guys. Bye. Thank you so much for joining me.